This is an audio version of my article, I Choose Ignorance. Content warning: mentions of abuse, rape, harassment, and white supremacy throughout the article. Abstract. I write this article in response to a letter and survey sent out on 31st of August 2023 by North Carolina WCPE's General Manager, Deborah S. Proctor. I also write this article to complement the Ciolkas 2023 article in which Ciolkas and NPR gave Proctor a national platform without challenging or contextualizing Proctor's white supremacist behavior. This could have been for a number of reasons, and I don't mean to disrespect Ciolkas. Journalists face many restrictions when writing articles, from word limits, forming trusts with an informant, how much they were paid, time constraints, and an editor's preferences and restrictions. Below, I will quickly contextualize Proctor's behavior within the white supremacist history of the US and look at how white supremacy has and continues to operate in classical music. This is a quick and dirty article because I am a busy PhD researcher in my last year and am traveling right now, touring a small show in the Outer Hebrides. I'm the first to admit that Proctor's behavior hit me personally as a neuroqueer, non-binary Mexican sound artist that hopes to write an opera one day. I will try my best to be as objective as possible, but please know that I do not excuse Proctor's white supremacist behavior, and sometimes my anger seeps through. Surprise there. Section 1. In the beginning was whiteness, and the whiteness was with God, and whiteness was God. Proctor's behavior is hypocritical at best. While claiming that she has a moral decision to make in regards to WCPE's programming, she does not really analyze how her moral compass is defined. She presents it as a universal between herself and her constituents. She worries about a child hearing discordant and difficult music and places herself on a white, quasi-religious pedestal while proclaiming, "When I stand before my Jesus Christ on Judgment Day, what am I going to say?" Well, that's a direct quote from her interview. I hope that she can be honest with Jesus and herself, not that I'm religious in any way. So when her judgment day does come, she can proudly say, "My Jesus, I blasted the marriage of Figaro on WCPE, which is about a count exercising his so-called right to rape servants. My Jesus, I blasted Carmen on WCPE, which is about femicide. My Jesus, I blasted Don Giovanni on WCPE, which starts with a rape scene." One of the first broadcasts WCPE did was Tosca, which involves an attempted rape by coercion. And a lot of that information I got from a blog post from the San Francisco Opera staff from 2022. In a letter and survey to her constituents, Proctor writes, "We strive to broadcast the classics which have earned the highest standing above all others, which are outstanding in their nature, quality, and eminence, and have stood the test of long-standing and widespread popularity, widely recognized as true classics." End quote. While this may seem like a noble cause to undertake, in practice it is an excuse that has been used by white supremacists to uphold white supremacy. In this case, a specific form of Christian white nationalism and supremacy. Whether Proctor's actions are conscious or subconscious, I think it is important to take a step back and contextualize Proctor's actions within the history of white supremacy in the US and in classical music. Nowhere in her letter or interview does she give an indication about who and how opera classics are defined, but based on her list of acceptable operas, which include Carmen, Orfeo, Romeo and Juliet, The Magic Flute, Les Noces de Figaro, La Bohème, Madame Butterfly, Die Fledermaus, the Verdi Requiem, Tannhauser, and a couple others. But we can extrapolate that from her list of classics. They're very much from a specific cis-het male white gaze. Proctor is not the first person to try and use religion, whiteness, and canon fundamentalism to defend one's action. And I define canon fundamentalism here as a belief in a group of works that has been primarily defined by cis-het white men. Ian Pace and Norman Lebrecht regularly use similar arguments to defend canon fundamentalism on social media. I almost said Carmen Sandiego there. Back to the point. Phyllis Schlafly, a now dead conservative grassroots advocate from the 70s and on, used similar logics to kill the Equal Rights Amendment. Both Proctor and Phyllis was known for this, consistently paint worst case scenarios, see Kennedy 2020, in their noble crusades for white purity. Proctor's interview and letter are filled with what-if scenarios impregnated with biblical guilt-ridden end-of-days language to manipulate her constituents into complicity for her own white supremacist Christian agenda. One which is not even consistent with itself, as when I went over the shows that she's played. Despite stating that she cannot in good faith program violence, as I have shared above, she continues to program operas from the white canon that have rape and femicide as pivotal plot points, but in a language other than English. I also questioned the construction of the survey. I was not able to view the whole survey, but the questions that were on the letter posted to X were extremely leading and biased toward Proctor's own views and anxieties that she shared in the NPR interview. I have a hard time believing her survey would pass through any ethics board. I say this now having been through an institutional ethics process for surveys and interviews twice in my time as a PhD researcher at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. I would argue that Proctor's letter and survey is more of a white supremacist call to action than an objective survey looking at the programming concerns of the station's constituents. She reveals her concerns in the letter first, before the survey, which align with white Christian nationalism, and therefore this risks confirmation bias in the responses, as well as igniting any anxieties people may or may not have already due to things such as Trumpism and long-held white supremacist viewers within our current social political lives. Section 2. Keeping things white. There is nothing new about the tactics Proctor is using at WCPE radio station to exclude black and Mexican composers, and even a white composer. White people and people who live in whiteness have used laws, cultural norms, and capital to uphold white supremacy. One of the strangest examples I have found outside of classical music are racial covenants. The Minnesota Libraries notes that, to quote, racial covenants are clauses that were inserted into property deeds to prevent people who were not white from buying or occupying land, end quote. Thompson and others, 2021, and Jones Correa, 2000, have written extensively about the generational oppression and damage these covenants had on black, brown, and indigenous people within the U.S. Collectively, as a nation, I think we enjoy forgetting that the civil rights movement was in the 60s, not too far long ago, with black citizens not having the right to vote until 1965. Yet, despite the civil rights movement, covenants still play a role today. Even in times of disaster, female loans tend to favor white people in white neighborhoods. See Flavellet 2021. The psychological effects of covenants and white supremacy are rarely, if ever, discussed or acknowledged amongst someone who is actively involved in white supremacist behavior, such as Proctor. While she regularly cries out about protecting white children and white families, she cannot or chooses not to talk about the damage she is causing to the careers of black and Mexican composers by excluding their music, history, culture, and stories from her station and listeners. It is the children's ears which must be protected at all costs, a refrain historically used by white cis-het Christian women. Reynolds, 2014, notes that, to quote, from around the middle of the 18th century, many people in Britain began to think about childhood in new ways. Previously, the Puritan belief that humans are born sinful as a consequence of mankind's fall had led to the widespread notion that childhood was a perilous period. As a result, much of the earliest children's literature is concerned with saving children's souls through instruction and by providing role models for their behavior. There is a direct line from this 18th century Puritan belief to Proctor, and I wonder if she knows this. I don't have time to dig into how white cis Christian women have weaponized childhood for their own agendas in US society specifically, but I do argue that that is one of the things Proctor is doing here. Why is it so hard for a certain white demographic to talk to their children about sex, slavery, and Black and Mexican cultures beyond me, but definitely a part of white ignorance? I see this as a mechanism for her to ignore the psychological damage she is doing to Black and Mexican composers by actively excluding them from the station, her station. I highly recommend the show Them from 2021, which depicts the horror of racial covenants from the perspective of a Black family moving to California in the 1950s. It is forms of oppression such as the racial covenants that empower Proctor to be who she is and to do what she is doing to keep things white. Historically, this is how white people continue to support white supremacy, whether it is passively or actively. To keep her and her listeners safe from any supposed oral attacks, she must always be vigilant of any sort of noise that may affect delicate white ears. Section 3. Delicate white ears. During the interview with Siokas, Proctor begins to cry as she summons yet again biblical language and guilt to defend what she is doing. Her tears may signify many things, but the one thing I want to focus on is how her tears expose her white fragility and oppress the Mexican and Black composers. When she cries, she makes herself the center of the conversation and someone who needs to be tended to and helped. She may act as if she has been wronged or attacked, when in reality it is Black and Mexican composers who are being wronged. But Proctor's tears have completely wiped them from the conversation. She's crying wolf. Akapati 2007 writes in her article titled When White Women Cry, How White Women's Tears Oppress Women of Color, and I quote, "Our societal norms inform us that crying indicates helplessness, which triggers automatic sympathy for the white woman." End quote. What I don't think Proctor realizes, and in fact most white people when confronted with their racist behavior, is that, end quote, white people set standards of humanity by which they are bound to succeed and others bound to fail. See Dyer 2005. Proctor has stated what her standards are for what she will and will not broadcast, and these criteria are essentially impossible for many contemporary composers to meet, for many reasons, which Proctor probably isn't even aware of, and for many reasons having to do with, but not limited to, equity, money, mentors, and access to classical music training. In recent U.S. orchestral seasons, BIPOC women have had less than 4% of performance time, while white men enjoyed over 60%. See Deemer and Neal's 2022. The Metropolitan Opera, only in 2021, commissioned its first Black composer. I cannot help but make connections between the actions of Proctor and the actions of other gatekeepers in our industry. Proctor and her listeners are more than complicit in their white supremacy. Proctor tries to justify and rationalize her actions by using her religious beliefs and the responses from her survey. These act as a code for "I am not racist," and in some ways she tries to unburden herself from her racist behavior by crying. Her actions and tears recenter herself and her whiteness, and essentially deracializes the bubble her and her constituents live in. When Proctor speaks about faith and values and needing to have decent programming for a general audience, she ignores the history of classical music's white supremacy. She is able to ignore the systemic difficulties BIPOC composers experience in the profession, and she cannot be racist because she is protecting families from deviance. She is a saint, but she wrongly assumes that we are all treated equally in a society and industry that regularly keeps us out. There's a list of references here. Go check them out. It's like 15. Section 4. Whiteness, Noise, and Discordant Hate. I don't have time to dive into the issue of how noise has been weaponized by white people against BIPOC communities, but this is an issue that comes up in both Proctor's interview and letter. One of the criteria she has for music played on the station is that it cannot be, to quote, modern, discordant, and difficult, end quote, music. This really hits home for me as many white people labeled my own family as loud while I was growing up, and I saw them label other people too, and I've seen it happen over and over again in different places that I've lived. Coyne at 2020, Stover 2016, and Wagner 2018, and many others have written about how noise and silence has been weaponized against BIPOC communities. And Stover 2016 in particular describes, to quote, that it is a racialized process in which certain bodies are expected to produce, desire, and live amongst particular sounds. Proctor fails to recognize Proctor fails to realize that her definition of music is not universal. As a station general manager, I argue that her criteria are highly unethical, especially as a publicly funded radio station. That someone can take public dollars and only play music that aligns with their white Christian nationalist values is quite disgusting, to say the least. That she's allowed to be a white supremacist with tax dollars is just appalling. Hako in 2013, in her book, The Music Libel Against the Jews, shows how since the there's a little mistake. She shows that since the first centuries of the Christian era, Gentiles have associated Jews with music. Hakon traces in her book the tensions between Jewish noise and idealized Christian harmony, and their artistic manifestations from the High Middle Ages through Nazi Germany and beyond. This is the same argument Proctor is using today against Black and Mexican composers, and it's tiring. It's just repackaged and reframed. And there's some great work that's been done on the colonizing force of European classical music. Check out my bibliography for sources. Another angle Proctor's actions can be understood through is that of mastery. She uses aesthetics steeped in white supremacy to reassert control and mastery over her world, the radio station. I understand the need of any arts and entertainment institution needing to hold on to their audiences, especially ones like WECP, which have been built over several decades. But I think another thing Proctor's survey fails to account for is the white hegemony amongst her constituency. Is anything really going to change if you're in a room full of white supremacists? Like, are they even able to see and admit to their white supremacy? And I think her survey shows that no, this can't happen in this case. I think it has been historically almost impossible to convince white supremacists that they are white supremacists. I've yet to know of any cases. I do not expect Proctor or her listeners to change, especially if they are left unchallenged, like in the NPR interview. But here I see another connection between Proctor's actions and how white people use mastery to segregate and reclaim urban spaces for themselves immediately following the U.S. Civil War. In his article, Walk With Me in White, Steedman lays out a theoretical framework to understand a historical and contemporary, and I quote, concept and practice of political autonomy centered on a notion of mastery, which is inextricably linked to race, gender, and class hierarchy. Steedman uncovers that during the period of 1880 to 1910, Atlanta was a place where Southern progressives used systematic tactics to civilize the recently freed slaves. White Southern progressives thought that, to quote, under the guidance of a paternalistic state, black Southerners might, over a sufficiently long time span, be brought to the level of civilization whites were thought already to have achieved. Page 341. Proctor, who has situated herself as a paternalistic leader in this situation, uses similar racist tactics at her station in order to uphold what she defines as civility and music. She, like her white supremacist ancestors, labels the actions of Black and Mexican composers as noisy, not art, not good enough for her and her constituents, and subpar. Despite us, and by that I mean BIPOC composers, the Black and Mexican composers, indigenous people, like all of us, despite us having to learn and master the master's language of English, this is even used against us by Proctor. So even if because we know English, she doesn't accept operas in English. In order to be a composer worthy of Proctor's radio station, I would have had to have learned yet another fucking language and written in a style not of my own. And that is what we call apartheid, whether she accepts it or not. Part 5, conclusion. I hope I have been able to just quickly show how damaging Proctor's behavior and actions are to BIPOC composers, and even some of the white ones, like the Philip Glass opera that was excluded. The history and narrative empowering Proctor to silence, exclude, and segregate her and her listeners from BIPOC composer is not new. It's tied to American exceptionalism, and it can be traced back to 18th century notions of white Christian childhoods, as well as how Jews were perceived by Christians as noisy from the Middle Ages and on. Her tactics were also used by Nazis to silence all those opposed to them. I cannot help but wonder what Proctor's Jesus will say. Again, not that I'm religious, but should she continue to choose ignorance? I do hope more people, especially journalists and big national organizations like NPR, will challenge white supremacy when it comes up. We can't let white supremacist behavior seem as neutral because it isn't. If you are interested in getting to know and support BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and disabled composers, do check out any one of the many databases for marginalized composers that have been constructed in the past 10 years. I think now more than ever we need to continue to support and share the art making of marginalized composers. Not everyone who is a contemporary composer composes harsh and dissonant music, and to assume that all composers today do that is just stupid and narcissistic. So see my article. It's linked in the comments of the video, in the description of the video, and on there at the bottom of the article, you'll see a big list of different databases. Thank you.